And Jeff's version's totally different. The version that I did was closer to the Muddy Waters version.
He said it plainly, without hesitation, in front of a room full of journalists who expected him to dodge the question. Jimmy Page, the man who built Led Zeppelin from nothing but session work and a stolen name from a joke about lead balloons, looked at the interviewer and named a band that most rock fans would never have guessed. Not a supergroup stacked with virtuosos. Not a band chasing arena ticket sales. A scrappy, blue-soaked group from Atlanta, Georgia, that critics loved to compare to Zeppelin but that Page insisted was doing something Zeppelin itself could never do again. The band was the Black Crowes, and the reason Page gave for his admiration says more about his philosophy of music than almost anything else he's ever revealed publicly. To understand why that statement carried so much weight, you have to go back to where Page's musical instincts were formed. Born in 1944 in a suburb of West London, he spent his early childhood in a fairly ordinary household until his family relocated to Epsom, Surrey. It was in that new house that he found an old Spanish guitar left behind by a previous owner, an instrument with no clear origin story. He didn't touch it right away. It sat in a corner of the house until curiosity got the better of him. At 12, a school friend taught him a handful of basic chords, and within weeks Page had already absorbed everything that friend knew. From there, he taught himself by ear, spending hours picking apart blues and rock records note by note. He would later admit, with a kind of self-deprecating honesty, that he picked up the guitar mostly because he was bored. What started as a way to kill time became an obsession that got him in trouble at school, where teachers regularly confiscated his guitar in hopes of getting him to focus on his coursework. He left school at 15, the earliest legal age allowed in Britain, having done just enough to scrape by academically. What followed was not a fairy tale rise. Singer Neil Christian recruited the teenage Page for his touring band, the Crusaders, and for 2 years Page lived the unglamorous reality of life on the road, cramped vans, poor food, exhaustion. A severe bout of glandular fever eventually forced him to quit touring and return home, a setback that turned out to be a hidden opportunity. He pivoted into session work in London, and within a remarkably short time became one of the most in-demand guitarists in Britain, recording behind artists like The Who, The Kinks, and the Rolling Stones, and contributing to the Beatles' film A Hard Day's Night. He played on Shirley Bass's Goldfinger session at Abbey Road, a moment he later called one of the highlights of his pre-Zeppelin career. But the session work also wore him down. Some estimates suggest he played on more than half of all commercial recordings made in Britain between 1963 and 1965, a workload so relentless that by the mid-1960s he was burned out, famously reaching his breaking point when he was booked to record elevator music. That exhaustion pushed him toward the Yardbirds in 1966, a band that had already launched Eric Clapton's career and briefly featured both Page and Jeff Beck on guitar at the same time. When the Yardbirds dissolved in 1968, Page was the only member left holding the band's remaining tour obligations. He assembled a new lineup almost from scratch, bringing in bassist John Paul Jones, singer Robert Plant, and drummer John Bonham. That lineup, initially billed as the New Yardbirds to fulfill contractual dates in Scandinavia, became Led Zeppelin, a name reportedly inspired by a joking remark from Keith Moon and John Entwistle about the project going down like a lead balloon. Page believed in the chemistry so strongly that he financed the band's debut album himself, using money earned from his session years. The gamble paid off when Atlantic Records signed the band to one of the largest recording contracts in history at the time, without ever seeing them perform live. What followed is well documented: the record-breaking tours, the dragon suit, the mysticism, Page's well-known fascination with Aleister Crowley and his purchase of Boleskine House on the shores of Loch Ness, and a level of commercial and creative dominance that reshaped what a rock band could be. But it also came with real darkness. Page has spoken candidly in various interviews over the years about losing large stretches of the 1973 American tour to substance use, and by 1975 he had developed a heroin dependency that lasted roughly 7 years, a period during which his playing grew inconsistent and his weight dropped visibly. The band absorbed a series of blows during this stretch, including the theft of a significant amount of cash from their hotel safe during the 1973 tour, and Page's own accident when he badly injured his ring finger in a train door just before a major tour, forcing him to adapt his playing technique on the fly. Then came September 24, 1980, when drummer John Bonham died after a day of heavy drinking, choking in his sleep at Page's home during rehearsals for what was meant to be the band's next tour. Led Zeppelin ended almost immediately afterward. For Page, the loss was devastating on a deeply personal level. By numerous accounts from people close to him at the time, he withdrew from public life, and his guitar reportedly sat untouched for close to 2 years, a silence that spoke to how thoroughly grief had taken hold. The years that followed were a search for footing. There was XYZ, a short-lived project with former Yes members Chris Squire and Alan White that never produced a full album but earned its wink of a name, short for Yes Zeppelin. There was The Firm, formed with Paul Rodgers of Bad Company, a partnership Page later credited with helping restore his confidence. There was the famously rocky Live Aid reunion in 1985 with Phil Collins filling in on drums, a performance so underwhelming by the band's own standards that they blocked its inclusion from the official Live Aid DVD release decades later. There was No Quarter in 1994, the acclaimed reunion with Robert Plant that reworked Zeppelin's catalogue through Middle Eastern instrumentation, though notably without John Paul Jones, who later revealed with dry humor at Led Zeppelin's 1995 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction that he'd found out about the reunion the same way everyone else did. It's against this backdrop of near misses, reunions that never quite recaptured the original spark, and a genuine reluctance to simply repackage the past, that Page's endorsement of the Black Crowes means something different than typical celebrity praise. In 1999, Page toured with the band, resulting in a live album that critics generally received well. He didn't stay for the full run, and the official explanation at the time cited back problems. Page later gave a more complicated account, suggesting he'd proposed writing original material with the band's chief songwriters, brothers Chris and Rich Robinson, an idea he felt was rebuffed, leading him to leave the tour early. Drummer Steve Gorman later said he was blindsided by that account when it surfaced. But even with that friction, Page's admiration for the band as musicians never wavered publicly, and it's rooted in something specific. The Black Crowes didn't try to become a tribute act. From their earliest records, they leaned hard into blues rock traditions without positioning themselves as Zeppelin cosplay. Songs like Hard to Handle and Twice as Hard demonstrated a band that understood the roots Page himself drew from, Delta blues, Muddy Waters, the raw electricity of early rock and roll, without simply photocopying Zeppelin's arrangements. When Page performed alongside them on songs like In My Time of Dying and 10 Years Gone, those weren't note-for-note recreations. They were reinterpretations, filtered through the Black Crowes' own instincts, and Page has said the experience reminded him of the excitement he felt making Zeppelin's earliest records, before the band's sound calcified into something audiences expected rather than something that surprised even the musicians playing it. That distinction, between imitation and inheritance, sits at the center of why Page singled this band out. He watched countless acts across the 70s, 80s, and 90s try to replicate Zeppelin's formula. The riffs, the mysticism, the sprawling live jams. Almost none of them lasted, because a sound built on constant reinvention cannot be freeze-framed and copied without losing the very thing that made it work. Page understood this better than most critics did, in part because he lived the alternative from the inside. Led Zeppelin's own catalogue reflects a band that refused to stay still, from the hard blues of their debut to the folk-inflected turn on their third album, recorded during a retreat to a Welsh cottage that alienated fans expecting another wall of distortion, to the genre-blending ambition of physical graffiti. Each record used a different recording engineer, a deliberate choice on Page's part to keep the band's sound tied to its own creative instincts rather than any single producer's fingerprint. He saw that same refusal to simply mimic the past in the Black Crowes, and it's why bands like Aerosmith and Judas Priest earned his respect too, not because they sounded like Zeppelin but because they took a similar spirit of blues-driven experimentation and pushed it somewhere new. Aerosmith carried the swagger forward into their own American strain of hard rock. Judas Priest took the heavier textures of Zeppelin's sound and helped forge something closer to what became heavy metal. For Page, influence was only valuable when it produced originality, not imitation, and that standard is exactly what separated the Black Crowes from the dozens of Zeppelin worship bands that rose and faded across 4 decades. There's a quiet irony in all of this. After Led Zeppelin ended, Page spent years chasing something that could recapture what the band had, through XYZ, through The Firm, through reunions that never fully satisfied him or the fans watching. And the closest he seemed to come to that old spark wasn't through resurrecting Zeppelin's name or reuniting with Plant on a nostalgia circuit. It came through a band nearly a generation younger than him, one that had grown up idolizing the very records he'd made in his 20s, and had found a way to honor that inheritance without being trapped by it. That, more than any technical skill or commercial success, appears to be what earned the Black Crowes his rare and specific praise. Not that they were better than Led Zeppelin in some measurable sense, but that they understood something about music that Page valued above almost everything else, the courage to build forward instead of only looking back. It's a lesson that outlived the man's most famous band by decades, and one that continues to separate the artists who fade from the ones who last. Jimmy Page didn't just define what rock guitar could sound like. He spent the rest of his career quietly pointing toward the bands who understood that the real tribute to a legacy isn't repeating it, but carrying its spirit somewhere it hasn't been yet.